Hello everyone. Welcome back to the channel. My name is Andre and I'm your bookworm. And today we have another book review. We're delving back into science fiction and we're going with one big author in science fiction, which is Andy Weir, and we're reviewing Artemis. For the ones that don't know, Artemis is a space opera science fiction, as I said just before. It's a standalone book, at least so far as time of recording of this video. Even though a lot of people think it is actually connected to The Martian or to Project Hail Mary, it is not. These three books are all standalones. And this one was published in 2017, and it won the Goodreads Choice Awards for science fiction in that same year. And more surprising is, it won actually a few more awards the year after, so lots of awards for this book. On Goodreads, this book has over 295,000 ratings, which I think is absurd in a good way, because that's just so many, especially for a book that was published 8 years ago. But the most surprising thing actually is the score it has, because even though it has all these, I don't know if it's even though, because I mean, what can we expect from numbers, but it has more than 200,000 ratings, but the score it has is of 3.69 out of 5. And in my opinion, what I thought when I read that this book had won a lot of awards and saw how many ratings it had, was that I was expecting a score that would be a bit higher than this. So seeing a 3.69 was quite surprising. But that just comes to show that the number of ratings doesn't really determine the score you have. It just determines how famous it is. And same thing goes for a lot of awards. You might not recognize this cover. This is from The Broken Binding. It was a special edition from their science fiction subscription. They did a subscription for the first three books of Andy Weir: The Martian, Artemis, and Project Hail Mary. And as you can see, they all have a similar cover, but different colors. The astronaut's face is slightly different. The spine has a different drawing. This one has an astronaut with stars and the moon and Earth. And the interior artwork is just the cover, but without all the layering, which I think also looks pretty good. As you can see, I've actually done a short for these books, so you can see that on the channel. I'm just showing again, so you can have a second view. But moving on to our usual housekeeping item, I'm going to read the synopsis. If you don't want to hear anything about it, then just skip to the timestamp. There should be down there a symbol for the timestamp that you can just skip, and it will jump right into review. It will skip this part if you don't want to hear any spoilers whatsoever, but I'll give you a few seconds so you can click on that. Yeah, all good. Let's go. Jazz Bashara is a criminal. Well, sort of. Life on Artemis, the first and only city on the moon, is tough if you're not a rich tourist or an eccentric billionaire. So smuggling in the occasional harmless bit of contraband barely counts, right? Not when you've got debts to pay and your job as a porter barely covers the rent. Everything changes when Jazz sees the chance to commit the perfect crime, with a reward too lucrative to turn down. But pulling off the impossible is just the start of her problems, as she learns that she stepped square into a conspiracy for control of Artemis itself, and that now her only chance at survival lies in a gambit even riskier than the first. And that is about it. And since we don't have any previous books to look the scores of, we can jump right into review, starting with plot. As you can guess from the synopsis, if you were here to hear me narrate it, we follow one major POV, which is Jazz. The plot of this book is quite short, and in the end, this is a short book. It's, I think, a bit close to 300 pages in this edition, and it actually feels like we just go with Shaz to go on a little adventure, and that is it. I finished the book thinking that something bigger and better was about to come, and I feel like once the arc of the story ended, there was something missing. It felt like there should be some even bigger stakes, or the plot should have continued progressing. But unfortunately no, and I think that's one of the big downfalls for this book. It is just a bit too simple. Okay that it is a space opera and there's a lot of explosions and action scenes, and I understand that we don't expect a lot of detail in the science part of it, like for example with Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson. But I also expect the plot to be a bit more substantial than what it was. I mentioned this in a wrap-up that I did a few weeks ago, but it feels like I just read what I consider a Sunday afternoon movie. And by this I mean that I just enjoyed something that is mildly enjoying, let's say. It's something that is entertaining, but I won't go to the cinema to watch it, for example. And if there was something better to watch, I would probably prioritize that other thing. I'm not saying that it is a bad plot. I feel like it just misses that oomph of emotion and triggering things to make you feel surprised or feel like there are actual big stakes involved. So for this category, I'm gonna give it a 3 out of 5. I think the plot does what it needs to do, but just barely. It sits right in the middle. It needed a little bit more substance. What about characters? Well, like I said, we follow one protagonist, which is Jazz, and that is pretty much the only character we focus development-wise. We see this character in more or less 2 time frames: the present, where the action is happening, and also in letters/emails that she sends when she's younger. I enjoyed that letter/email part because it gives us a bit more context of who Jazz is and why she acts the way she acts and what led her to be at the point she is when we start this story. As for the present Jazz, I felt like she was a bit rough around the edges. And I don't mean this personality-wise, because yes, she is rough around the edges, but I just felt like she was lacking a bit of depth. But that didn't disturb me that much. I just thought that it could have been improved, because the rest of the characters were also so paper thin in terms of richness of personality and everything. And in the end, most of them just felt like they existed to fulfill one purpose in the story. And once that purpose was done, that was it. They wouldn't show up more. So they didn't feel like real individuals. So I would say there's a good work on the main character, but the side characters really lacked a lot of it. So for me, the score for this category is going to be a 4 out of 5. But it's a low 4, almost on the 3. Moving on to world building, this book is all spent in a base in the moon. And this is not spoiler whatsoever, this is just basic setup. We do not explore much outside this city or this base. And whilst the concept of the city and the city itself seemed interesting, everything else seemed quite vague. And of course, if the focus of the story is within that city, it is normal for us to spend more time in that city or for the descriptions of the city to be more detailed. However, I would have liked to have a bit more sense of what's happening outside of that base, in the moon itself, because there are other structures in the moon. And not only that, but also the interactions between the moon and Earth. So like the peoples that live in these 2 places and how they interact. A bit more of that could have helped. I do appreciate the city descriptions and descriptions of the people and things like the currency of the moon base. I think they were smartly described. I think they were coherent with the story and with the world in itself. Sometimes they did feel a bit YA, in the sense that it was a bit too obvious what was happening, the way things were segregated, but I could still accept it because within the story it made sense. So for this category, I'm also going to give a 4 out of 5. Writing style is our second last category, and what do we have to say about this? Well, Andy Weir's prose is good, simple, quite direct, not too flowery, goes directly to the point. And on top of that, because this book is more of a space opera and not hard sci-fi, then the descriptions of the science aren't so bothersome and they aren't so detailed. Therefore, it allows the book to move a bit faster. I do think that some of the lines, some of the dialogue between characters could have been improved, because sometimes it did feel a bit too blockbuster / nonsensical for the situation in question, and it felt more, let's create some drama instead of things that people could actually say. But aside from that, it's a simple prose. As for pacing, I think it has good pacing, as much as it can have in a book with 300 pages. But since the plot itself is quite short, it doesn't allow much maneuver for the pacing to go up and down like you would in a book with 600 pages, for example. But I mean, the book that I reviewed last week, Weird Sisters by Terry Pratchett, had, I think, a more dynamic pacing than this one, and that book was 200 pages long. But it's still an okay pacing. So for this category, I'm going to give it a 4 out of 5. And finally, let's talk about enjoyment. As you can guess from what I've said so far, I thought this book was okay, entertaining at points, but it never got me really hooked or wanting to read it. I was reading this book for the sake of knowing what was happening next, but at the same time, because I was reading other books concurrently, they were always getting the priority. Not to say that the book was bad and I was dreading to read it like it has happened with books that I've reviewed in the past. Nothing like that. It was more of a case of, meh, okay, let's do it. So for this category, I'm gonna give it 3 out of 5. And that ends our review. Just as a refresher, we have 3 for plot, 4 for characters, world building, writing style, and then 3 for enjoyment, which gives us a score of 3.6 out of 5. Not the best outcome, but at the same time, it is quite similar to the Goodreads score, which tells me that on average, people think like I do. I think it's an okay book, definitely not as good as The Martian or Project Hail Mary, and I think the plot is the main culprit because it is just too simple. But hey, an author can't keep just pumping out bestsellers left, right, and center. Sometimes some of them will be a bit less good than others. So yeah, so if I had to recommend a book by Andy Weir, Artemis wouldn't be it. Probably if you read all the other Andy Weir books, go ahead and read this one like I did, but don't expect too much out of it. But for the ones that have read this book, what do you think? Do you think this one is actually the best one, or which of the other 2 is your favorite Andy Weir book? Comment down below, and if you're new, don't forget to subscribe, like the content, and I'll be seeing you on Thursdays and Sundays, okay? See you soon.